First, thank you. She didn't hear me. Hearing on the of the 116th Congress. This afternoon's hearing will focus on ways to increase community resilience and the impacts that natural disasters have on the budget process. Since 1980, the United States has endured 250 weather-related disasters where the overall damages were at or above $1 billion. In total, these catastrophes have resulted in over 13,200 deaths and an economic loss of over $1.7 trillion. However, the billion-dollar disasters only tell one side of the story. This summer, and as late as last week, torrential downpours flooded huge swaths of the Midwest and Southeast, triggering flash floods in Tennessee, Kentucky, and last week in Beaumont, Texas, and Houston, Oklahoma, North Carolina, Illinois, and then Bill Johnson's in my home state of Florida. Beyond flash flooding, rising rivers in Iowa threatened local communities' drinking water. Wildfires and mudslides broke out in California, and there were droughts in the Dakotas. Weeks and weeks of rain across the Great Plains and the Midwest have kept many farmers from planting crops. In Arkansas, just half of the state's soybean crop had been planted by early June, compared with 90% at the same time last year. By the end of June, the flooding was so intense and widespread that at least 11 states sought federal disaster funds for more than 400 affected counties. Events like these disrupt daily life because devastation and death, and generate billions of dollars in losses. But as policymakers, we sometimes fail to detail how disasters affect people's well-being, especially when we consider disadvantaged communities are usually among those who bear the brunt of natural disasters. Disparities exist before disaster strikes, and recovery plans rarely account for these inequities, which embeds these disparities further. Let me give you an example of that is a tragedy that all of us are aware of. In Abaco, there was an area called Mud in Abaco. Interestingly, the inhabitants of that little part of Abaco came from Haiti that had fled the earthquake disaster. And the disparities in the Bahamas allowed that they lived in mud. And when the hurricane just came through, I see Bill nodding his head. The thought is that many of them were just washed out to sea. It was in an area where the disaster relief people couldn't get to it as quickly. And that's an example of the disparity in another country. And I could go do the same thing in Puerto Rico and several other places. I could show you where that happened. I've personally seen the frustration and despair that sets in for communities when the federal government's disaster response falls short or takes too long or is so convoluted or that many families struggle to understand what benefits they might be eligible for. Let me be clear. More extreme weather is going to come whether we like it or not. And while we cannot stop natural disasters from hitting, we can control how we prepare and how we recover from them. While the current disaster supplemental process helps communities rebuild following natural disasters, it rarely makes individuals and businesses whole. And it cannot take the place of proactive federal government programs specifically designed to prepare communities before the next natural disaster hits. No region of our great country is immune to natural disasters. Therefore, I believe we must channel all of our energies into developing and implementing a national resiliency plan that empowers all of our communities to build a smarter and stronger future. This means not only unleashing the power of the federal government, but also of cities, towns, urban and rural and suburban communities. It requires us to make the necessary investments in infrastructure and renewable energy to spur job creation in construction, manufacturing, and adaptation and mitigation technology. And failing to do so may very well cost us millions of jobs and trillions of dollars in the upcoming few years. We have the power to move towards a more sustainable and equitable future for all. And it's my hope that this hearing will help us clarify these challenges and set us on the path of addressing them in a more comprehensive fashion. I now recognize my good friend, the distinguished ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Woodall, for any opening statement he wishes to make.
Mr. Chairman, I very much appreciate that, and I appreciate your holding the hearing today. I wanted to be the first, given this panel of amazing folks that are here before us, to introduce one of the witnesses that our team has invited, and that's Dr. Marvin Fopp. Dr. Fopp is the resident scholar and professional lecturer at the Trachtenberg School of Public Policy and Public Administration at George Washington University and specializes in teaching federal budget concepts and policy. I'd like to believe some of that is the result of work that he did here when he was the head of the Financial Studies and Budget Process Group over at the Congressional Budget Office, and from there he went on to be the Director of Federal Budget Reform Initiative with the Pew Charitable Trusts. He's also served as a senior economist with the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, a fellow at the National Academy of Public Administration, received the Kenneth Howard Award for Lifetime Achievement in Public Budgeting and Finance from the Association of Budgeting and Financial Management, and the National Distinguished Service Award from the American Association of Budget and Program Analysis. That is a long list of professional accomplishments, but I hope that we will dwarf those with testimony before the House Rules Subcommittee here today. Mr. Chairman, as the former chairman of this subcommittee, I know how much it takes to put a hearing together, and I want to thank you and your team for all the hard work. You would expect, your staff has been incredibly gracious working with my staff. I know that comes from the top in the same way that you are very gracious working with each and every one of us. And I want to thank you for the spirit with which you put this hearing together. I remember one of the first issues I got to work on the Budget Committee when I was elected back in 2011 was the Budget Control Act, which tried to do some of what we're talking about today. While it restrained discretionary spending across the board for the first time, it tried to forward fund disaster payments to say, we know that we're going to have these challenges. Let's go ahead and be honest about what that cost is going to be to the taxpayer. Now, you're trying to take that one step further in these resiliency hearings, not to bail folks out on the back end, but what can we do to solve problems on the front end? I know other committees in the House are working on this. On the T&I committee, on which I serve, we marked up 2 bills last week, the Resilience Revolving Loan Fund Act and the Prepare Act. We actually passed the Prepared Act in this Congress last year as a part of H.R. 4, but it didn't make it across the finish line. I happened to have Googled House committees and resilience hearing before I came over today. We'll see results from the Science Committee doing resilience hearings, the Budget Committee, the Oversight Committee, the Select Committee on Climate Crisis, the Natural Resources Committee, and more. That's just at the federal level. Of course, we see even more going on at the state and local level. This is the right time to have this conversation, Mr. Chairman, and while I would like to think you and I are both experts in congressional budget process, I know we are not yet experts in resiliency funding and financing pre-disaster mitigation techniques, and so I will take no more time, and so we can get on to the experts that you have here before us. I'm grateful again for your friendship and your partnership, and I yield back.
Thank you so very much, and thank you for bringing attention to the fact that staff has done an incredible job getting these outstanding witnesses here, but talking with others around the country as well. Particularly in North Carolina, we paid a lot of attention to some of the concerns that we were able to get from their people. I also am mindful we are more East Coast oriented than we are West Coast on this hearing, but hopefully we'll be able to follow through and take into consideration the concerns that they have in the Dakotas and in California and other places. Our witnesses today are experts in the field, all of them. And I want to welcome them and introduce four of them, and thank you for introducing the doctor who has extraordinary credentials. First, Bill Johnson, my friend, he and I have suffered hurricanes galore in our area. He serves as the Director of Emergency Management in Palm Beach County. And Bill has guided Palm Beach in its response to several disaster incidents. He's a registered nurse, a certified paramedic, and certified emergency manager. Next, we have Heather Tawny, who served as the first African-American, first female, and youngest mayor of Greenville, Mississippi. Heather also served as regional administrator for the Environmental Protection Agency's Southeast region during the Obama administration, and she currently serves as the National Field Director for Moms Clean Air Force. That's something I want to hear more about. I see a couple of the ladies here as well. Third, we have John Piatti, who is the current CEO and president of American Farmland Trust, an organization dedicated to protecting agricultural land, promoting environmentally friendly farming practices, and keeping farmers and ranchers on their land. And John has over 20 years of executive management and public policy experience. And last but not least, we have Ms. Catherine Hamilton, who is Executive Director of Advanced Energy Management Alliance, an association of providers and supporters of distributed energy resources, including demand response and advanced energy management, united to overcome barriers to nationwide use of demand-side resources. Bill, I'd like if you would deliver your testimony first, and then we'll go straight down the aisle.
Thank you, Congressman Hastings. Really appreciate it. And again, good to see you again, and thank you,
Get
everyone.
your mic there if it's not on.
Okay. You hear me now?
Okay.
Again, thank you for the invitation today. The desire to make our communities more disaster resilient is not new. Experience has repeatedly demonstrated that lives can be saved, damage to property can be reduced significantly, and economic recovery can be accelerated by consistently building safer and stronger buildings, strengthening existing infrastructures, enhancing building codes, and making the proper preparations before a disaster occurs. Modern-day mitigation has been evident since the late 1980s when the Stafford Act was passed. In 1990, the Community Rating System was established, and later James Lee Witt, FEMA administrator from 93 to 2001, launched Project Impact, the program in 1997 to build community partnerships, identify community hazards and vulnerabilities, and prioritize risk reduction strategies. I'm giving out my age, but I witnessed firsthand the benefits of Project Impact. We elevated homes, we improved storm drainage systems, we fortified and relocated structures, and we hardened buildings and homes. In 2005, we learned that for every dollar spent on mitigation results in a $4 return on avoided future losses, and more recently, we're finding that that ratio is closer to 7 to 1. A dollar investment in mitigation can save an average of $6 to $7 in response and recovery spending. It seems to me that the current federal mitigation programs are built backwards, or at the least, upside down. Despite the plenty of evidence, the value and efficacy of mitigation strategies, funding for mitigation is a mere fraction of the funding for the after-the-fact, post-disaster response. Instead of focusing its efforts on minimizing the impact of national disasters, FEMA is mired with cleaning up after them. Representative Hastings, you talked about $250 billion, or 250 weather disasters amounting for more than $1 billion in damages. And again, in terms of disaster relief, we've seen that number go as high as $140 billion. In terms of mitigation, however, over its 12-year history, funding levels for pre-disaster mitigation program, or PDM, have risen and fallen anywhere between 50 and 150 million. Despite the success of the Project Impact Program, mitigation funding has continued to be well below the need. In 2018, only $235 million in PDM funds were appropriated, a drop in the bucket compared to the $89 billion in supplemental appropriations alone for disaster response, also in 2018. The Hazard Mitigation Program aims to reduce loss of life and property from future natural disasters by providing funding to state and local governments for mitigation projects after a major disaster declaration. HMGP funds are by far the majority of mitigation fund dollars appropriated by the federal government, and essentially we must wait for a major disaster to be eligible for a great majority of mitigation dollars. Another example, not related to hurricanes, but further emphasizes an all hazards rethink, and that is the Homeland Security Grant Program began in 2003 for the purpose of procuring surveillance equipment, weapons, and advanced training for local first responders in order to heighten our preparedness. We have purchased personal protective equipment, rescue equipment, communications equipment, and more, all aimed at the immediate response to a terrorist incident. $1 billion were allocated to HSGP in 2019. Now, while I'm absolutely committed to protecting our first responders and ensuring their safety, after 16 years, we have allocated billions of dollars focused purely on the first 7 minutes of a terrorist incident. However, we are learning from the post-incident analyses of terrorist and mass shooting events that recovery from these events is a prolonged process. After 7 minutes or less, nearly all incidents are over, but the hard work is just beginning, and that hard work lasts over 7 years. The trauma, medical care, physical rehab, economic recovery, and mental anguish will linger for years, only to resurface annually on the anniversary of that incident. In Palm Beach County, we are using creative strategies to steer more funding toward recovery. We have drafted a family assistance and survivor care center plan and have exercised it twice and have plans to exercise it more. Addressing mental health and behavioral health symptoms immediately after a mass shooting event can help mitigate the long-term post-traumatic stress, depression, and suicides. Our next phase for community resiliency centers will serve as an ongoing resource and referral center for those affected by such events. Another example about mitigation, we all remember, it's in my mind permanently, the photo of the single home still standing nearly unscathed on Mexico Beach, Florida, after the entire neighborhood that was surrounding that home was annihilated by Hurricane Michael. The 3-story home was built on 40-foot pilings, constructed of reinforced concrete, steel cables, and a metal roof. Estimates of the construction costs were only about 15 to 20% more than standard costs. This may sound expensive, but only the windows in one room, a set of stairs, and an air conditioning unit were damaged by the storm, a far cry from the total rebuild costs throughout the catastrophic destruction done in the surrounding neighborhood. Even the private sector is engaged in mitigation. In Florida Power and Light, the largest energy company in the United States with over 15 million customers, has made over $4 billion in investments. And I'm here to prove to say that over the last 3 years of storms, we have noticed that and have seen how our electrical grid system has remained more storm resilient. The takeaway here, ladies and gentlemen, is building materials matter, building codes work, and mitigation works. Let's talk just briefly about sustainability. Hurricane Hermine was the first hurricane to make landfall in Florida since Wilma in 2005. Emergency managers worked hard during that 11-year funding drought to keep our partners engaged, interested, and enthusiastic about mitigation. We shared best practices, success stories, and maintained our project priority list, which went unfunded for years. We put a lot of time and effort and resources into mitigation without any incentive. Luckily, the Emergency Management Performance Grants, EMPG, they fund local emergency management programs to staff and promulgate those mitigative campaigns, such as the Local Mitigation Strategy. Local mitigation strategies are ongoing programs that need to survive even during disaster droughts. However, local mitigation strategies must have the resources behind them to maintain them. to provide the mitigation projects, to facilitate them, and make sure that they are shovel-ready. Further support of the EMPG program, or at least maintenance of the EMPG program, will assure that mitigation remains at the forefront of local preparedness programs nationwide. Let me repeat, however, that when communities are trying to dig themselves out of a major disaster, it seems odd to me to throw millions of mitigation dollars at them at that time. Let me conclude by recommending a rethink of the current mitigation programs and funding. Let's flip them over 180 degrees so they are right side up. Let's change the focus to mitigation and less on cleaning up after the fact. As with Project Impact, let's showcase creative resiliency strategies, best practices, and let's celebrate success stories instead of incentivizing salvage operations. Finally, let's sustain local emergency management programs, which are at the forefront of resiliency. Thank you again.
Thank you, Ms. Tawny.
Thank you, Chairman Hastings, Ranking Member Woodall, Chairman McGovern, thank you for being here, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify about the role of resiliency in facing the impacts of natural disasters. My name is Heather Tawny. I proudly serve as National Field Director for Moms Clean Air Force. We are an organization of over 1.2 million moms, dads, grandmas, all kinds of folks that are united against air pollution and climate change for the sake of our children's health. But my road to this position came and traveled through public service. I previously served as regional administrator for the Environmental Protection Agency's Southeast region under President Obama, and before that, a former mayor of my hometown of Greenville, Mississippi, for 2 terms. When our first major flood hit in 2008, I was beginning my 2nd term and really focusing on infrastructure development in the city. I'd spent my entire first term bringing the city back from the brinks of financial ruin as we were heavily in debt and needed rebuilding badly. So after carefully cutting and saving, we were excited to do things like street rebuilding and preparing our city's foundation for economic development. But when the Northeast winter snow began melting and flowing downriver to our banks, we saw that the river was going to be high and higher than it was before. It reached flood stage and stayed there for over a month. Homes were flooded, fields were lost, water lines broke, sewer lines leaked. What I was not prepared for was the impact that this would have on our city budget. You see, cities are required to submit a balanced budget to the state no later than September 15th, as the new budget year begins on October 1st. For this reason, most cities begin budget sessions in late July to August in order to adequately prepare, debate, and vote. When an extreme weather event such as a flood, hurricane, or storm hits during the spring or summer months, the city must allocate funds to address the need without the assurance of money to replace the money that has been used. For example, the money used for police and fire overtime due to a federal emergency extreme weather crisis are not only not budgeted, they're not replaced in time for the current budget cycle due to the length of time it takes to receive a federal declaration, assessment of damages, and then receipt of funds. In 2011, when the crisis flood waters returned, I'd learned a few lessons. Fellow mayors reached out to each other to provide immediate assistance. At the time, Harvey Johnson, mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, sent public work crews with concrete barriers to help us fill the gaps in our levee system. In turn, once we were secured, we sent our emergency management personnel to Vicksburg, Mississippi, to assist them in preparing for the flood waters headed their way. Even though no one can budget for a storm, we saved as much as we could. We had to forego needed city assessment purchases like garbage trucks and things that citizens had prepared for. We worked with local churches to help prepare the community for the impending devastations. We relied on each other because each other was all that we had. I recalled my Facebook post to the community on May 22nd of 2011, and it read, "Toured Vicksburg's flooded area this morning with Mayor Paul E. Winfield. He's doing a great job and is on top of the problem. Discuss next steps for our towns with respect to cleanup and restoration for residents and businesses. I worship with the good folks at Travelers Rest Worship Center. God is in control." As I sit before you today, I still believe that God is in control, and He's trusting us to use the God-given good sense to trust the science all around us that tell us these storms will worsen if we don't act. While I'm no longer mayor today, my good friend and classmate Eric Simmons is mayor. And he was on MSNBC just last week sharing that the 2019 floods, which have come yet again, have assessed the municipal damages to the city of over $4 million. In 2011, mine was simply $600,000. With a city of a 38.6% poverty rate, making the necessary repairs with an annual street budget of only $300,000, you can see that the burden lies heavily on poor people, and we're trying to figure out how to make sure we survive. When we looked over the numbers for 2019, $800,000 in damages to roads and bridges alone are what people are driving on and trying to get to work and get their children to school each and every day. The new budget session begins on October 1st. Today is September 24th. If we don't act, we continue to put poor people, families, and children in danger. This is not an opportunity for us to continue a debate. It's an opportunity for us to make a decision that saves lives. And we have the tools if we work together and use them, and I believe wholeheartedly that we can. And for that reason, I'm happy to be here and answer any questions of this committee. Thank you.
Mr. Bialy?
Chairman Hastings, Ranking Member Woodall, Chairman McGovern, it's a pleasure to be here today. Thanks for the opportunity to testify. I applaud the committee for dealing with this issue of resiliency. It's critically important to our farmers and our rural communities, and your purpose aligns closely with the work of the organization I run, American Farmland Trust. Since our founding in 1980, AFT has helped permanently protect 6.5 million acres of farmland with agricultural conservation easements, making sure that that land will forever be available, not only to grow food, but to provide a range of environmental services, including those that increase resiliency. At the same time, we have helped advance farming practices on millions of additional acres that have also enhanced resiliency. And we have promoted policies and provided services that have helped over 500,000 farmers stay in business. AFT for decades has undertaken a combination of research and policy work and programming in multiple states, but my purpose today is not to recount any of that, but rather to outline some of the issues that we see out in the field where it's essential to America's farmers and rural America that we take steps to enhance resiliency. I'm going to highlight 4 areas. The first, how better farming practices boost resiliency. AFT has spent much of its history helping farmers improve soil health through practices that include reduced tillage, plowing up the ground less, and active use of cover crops and crop rotations. Building soil health has numerous benefits, including these. Healthier soil soaks up more water and can store more of it. And this, by keeping water on the fields, reduces the runoff to streams and rivers, and thereby reduces the severity of flooding. And you can see this yourself if you go out and drive around in the community after a heavy rain. When there's bare ground, you see runoff. And when there's cover on the field, be it crop residue or cover crops, you don't see it. Everything seems much better. The second point, maintaining fields with cover crops and perennials, or even with the residue from the last harvest of crops, keeps soil in place during periods of heavy flooding. And farms managed with these practices will be able to bounce back much more quickly after an extreme event. Third, keeping soil on farm fields will also reduce recovery costs downstream because there will be less sediment to clean up. There are many examples of how this past spring's heavy rainfall has prevented farmers from planting or forced them to plant late. You heard Chairman Hastings mention a few at the outset. Yet AFT has heard from farmers who use practices like no-till and cover crops that they were often able to farm much earlier than their neighbors. One of the most commonly heard comments was that regardless of how much rainfall there was, farmers who had cover crops saw little soil erosion and could get back on their fields sooner. The second point I want to make, agricultural conservation easements can help mitigate flooding. Farmland provides a natural means of tempering stormwater and floodwaters. It is often the development that could occur on farmland that funnels stormwater in ways that exacerbate the negative impacts. Hurricane Harvey, which hit Texas in 2017, as we'll all remember, is a real example of this. So much farmland around Houston had been developed that the city no longer retained a natural resiliency. Sadly, this is happening in Houston right now again. Another example of where development has led to increased flooding is in the Pioneer Valley of western Massachusetts. The devastation that occurred as a result of Hurricane Irene, that Chairman McGovern knows all too well, many farms were underwater, and sadly, a lot of soil washed down the Connecticut River into the ocean. The irony is that the farms were hurt by the fact that there is less farmland in the area now than there once was. Development occurring on farmland puts remaining farmland at a higher risk. This doesn't need to be what happens. We can use agricultural conservation easements to mitigate potential flooding. A few states are using the Federal Hazard Mitigation Grant Program to buy floodplain conservation easements. The first application that we're aware of occurred in the late 1990s in Illinois following flooding along the Mississippi. Another example was in 2001 in Nebraska. Yet sadly, these are rare instances. FEMA needs to raise awareness of how conservation easements can be used to target agricultural lands that would be a natural buffer to flooding. The third item that I want to identify is how farms can play a critical role in flood attenuation and groundwater recharge. We're talking about floods here, but we have to remember that through much of the country, we also have a problem with water supply, right? And there's an opportunity at times to address both issues simultaneously. In California, farmers are creatively working to both minimize the negative impacts of floods and help save floodwater for future use. And the written testimony provides a couple of examples that I won't go into now, but the point is we need more innovative projects of this sort. And the fourth point I wish to make is that farms and farmers also enhance resiliency in other ways. So far today, I've been talking about how farms can help buffer floods and storms through on-the-ground practices. But I want to mention two other ways that farms enhance resiliency. First, I'll stress how the economic and environmental health of so many rural communities is tied directly to the vibrancy of farming. And as we all know, the overall health of rural communities is critical to their resiliency and capacity for adaptation. Thus, it's critical that farming remain vital if rural communities are to remain healthy. We know that many farm communities are struggling for a variety of reasons that are beyond today's hearing. But my point is that any strategy designed to enhance rural resiliency must have at its core efforts to help strengthen farming. Second, I want to mention the roles that farmers often play in rural communities in a crisis. Farmers, more often than not, are key contributors to a community, perhaps as volunteer firemen or as first responders. Beyond that, farmers often possess exactly what's needed in time of crisis, be that heavy equipment or the know-how to use it, or stored foodstuffs, or barns or warehouses that can be used to shelter people or supplies. Simply put, farms and farmers are essential to rural resiliency. I thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to any questions.
Ms. Hamilton, just before you begin, the chairman is going to have to leave to go to a meeting, and so I can set the parameters here for the remaining portion of the hearing as well. At 4 o'clock, the Democrats have a caucus scheduled, and many of the members here are going to have to attend that. I don't have to attend. I can if I choose, but I'm here for you all. So I'm going to be prepared to forego my questions so that I can hear from the members on both sides. But right now, Chairman, if you have anything you wish to contribute to us or leave a couple of questions with us.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I guess the question, and I'm going to have to leave, but is what's our assignment here? I mean, what are we're hearing some great conversation, and I know that there'll be even greater conversation as we go on. But, what are the two things that Congress must do right now to help our communities become more resilient and to strong, damaging storms? And so that's when, after everybody's testified. But let me just thank Chairman Hastings and Ranking Member Woodall for holding this subcommittee hearing. And I think it comes as no surprise that Chairman Hastings would focus his first hearing on something so important to his constituents and, frankly, to the entire nation as to how to protect our communities from dangerous and inexpensive storms. And so, this issue of resiliency, as Mr. Woodall pointed out, is being discussed by a lot of committees, but it is something, quite frankly, we should have been discussing a long time ago, right? And so I appreciate what I've heard up to this point. I have your testimonies, which I've read in advance, and I appreciate that as well. But I will turn this back over to Chairman Hastings, and again, thank you for your leadership.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Hamilton?
Thank you, Chairman McGovern. Thank you, Chairman Hastings. Thank you, Ranking Member Woodall, and to the entire committee for inviting me to testify today. My name is Catherine Hamilton. I'm Executive Director of the Advanced Energy Management Alliance. We focus on customer resources that can provide cost-effective, resilient, flexible, and clean solutions to our nation's electric grid. AEMA works to ensure that resources such as rooftop solar, demand response, energy efficiency, smart inverters, batteries, thermal storage like hot water heaters, fuel cells, combined heat and power, microgrids, electric vehicles, and geothermal heat pumps are taken into consideration to provide resilience to our electric grid. While federal agencies give grants for rebuilding, preparation in advance of these events using flexible technologies can lessen the burden both on the communities and on the government. Distributed energy resource deployment has provided resilience to our grid, whether because of extreme temperature, natural disaster, or even the solar eclipse. The ability to fail fast and recover fast is particularly suited to these resources. As far back as Hurricane Sandy, microgrids in New York and New Jersey enabled universities to continue operation in the face of massive power outages, providing a haven to others without electricity. PJM interconnection credited demand response with helping the grid withstand the polar vortex in January of 2014. As multiple winter peaks were set, demand response, which is only required to respond during summer peaks, reduced load more than most generating resources, allowing the system to function reliably. After Hurricane Irma, demand response helped maintain balance between supply and demand to stabilize the Florida electric grid. As thousands of customers were rapidly having their power restored, demand threatened to outpace supply and cause additional blackouts. Tampa Electric Company had the foresight to install a diverse set of distributed resources. As Hurricane Harvey unleashed trillions of gallons of rainwater along the Gulf Coast, there was a range of energy impacts, including coal to gas switching, as coal piles were too wet for conveyor systems to handle. Texas Medical Center, the largest medical facility in the world, was able to sustain critical loads throughout the storm, thanks to a combined heat and power system which operated without interruption. During heat waves in California, hundreds of energy storage facilities in San Francisco were called upon to operate collectively as virtual power plants, reducing demand on an overtaxed grid. And during the solar eclipse in 2017, over 750,000 consumers lowered their Nest thermostats to reduce demand by 700 megawatts as electrical systems across the country were displaced into temporary darkness. Given wildfire season in California and even today, the calling of public safety outages there, microgrids and other distributed resources will only become more important. It is critical that the federal government provide best practice planning and technical assistance for at-risk communities through the FEMA Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grant Program. We need federal programs also that can leverage private financing. An example of a local organization that has provided resilience services is Florida Solar and Energy Loan Fund, SELF. It is a CDFI that raises low-cost capital from private entities and then delivers clean energy and climate resilience, like roof repairs and replacement, impact windows, hurricane shutters in underserved neighborhoods. SELF has helped finance fortified roofs that reduce home insurance rates by as much as 50%, enabling homeowners to pay for those projects, keep their insurance, and lower their energy bills from the solar rooftop power. Having a national nonprofit entity such as the National Climate Bank Act that was introduced in the Senate could fund regional resilience projects and enable more states to create and seed institutions like SELF that serve frontline communities. The Department of Defense has identified the most at-risk bases for resilience needs in states as diverse as Florida, Georgia, Texas, Virginia, Utah, Oklahoma, Missouri, Maryland. Forts Benning in Georgia and Gordon in Georgia have both established resilience plans with solar energy as a key component. These examples and many others in my written testimony illustrate that customer-based distributed resources that are available today can provide critical services to the grid when it needs them the most. These technologies and financing mechanisms are resources we should implement before a hurricane strikes our coast, a flood destroys our business, or a heat wave endangers our most vulnerable populations. I urge the committee to take these solutions into consideration as we look broadly and strategically about how, as a nation, we prepare for and respond to events that are beyond our control. The very solutions we choose could have the co-benefits of reduced cost of and time for recovery, increased jobs and economic development for communities at risk, and reduced environmental impact through clean, flexible technologies. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify before the committee.
Dr. Falk?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Woodall, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to speak with you about this important and timely topic. I'm especially appreciative of the chance to bring a budget and economics perspective to your discussions. I'm also grateful for this chance to briefly summarize and perhaps clarify my written statement. I also would thank Mr. Woodall for his kind and generous introduction, but I was reminded of a response once given by James Dickey, who was at one time Poet Laureate of the U.S. and also a Clemson football player, who said after a similar introduction, "I wish my now deceased parents could have been here. My father would have been proud, but my mother would have believed every word." So thank you for that, Mr. Woodall. The gist of my statement is really pretty simple. It is to recommend that you consider integrating all federal spending for disasters into the regular budget process. That would require giving up the use of emergency spending to fund a significant portion of outlays for disasters. Those funds would not be lost to disaster relief and recovery, however, but rather would be provided through the process I've described in my written statement. I make this recommendation because I think it would enhance the effectiveness and efficiency of existing federal spending for disasters. It would also be consistent with current efforts to improve overall federal budget process. There appear to be three distinct elements to our disaster policy. One, of course, is providing immediate relief to those who are suffering severe loss. And over the longer term, to promote mitigation of losses, especially in rebuilding structures that have been lost, but also making, thirdly, new investments to increase the efficiency of both of the two previous objectives. My impression is that most of the money for relief appears to come from the regular appropriation, but certainly very large amounts for mitigation and investment are provided under the emergency designation, which is, importantly, outside the regular budget process and free of Budget Act control. From the viewpoint of specialists in budget response, the current process may seem highly desirable, but there is a downside to this current budget treatment. It makes spending for emergencies appear falsely to be free. It appears that nothing has to be given up or sacrificed by the decision to allocate resources to this purpose. No one else's spending needs to be reduced. No one's taxes or fees need to be increased now. When the cost of an activity in a decision process is zero, it's rational to keep spending more of it until the benefit of the last unit is zero. That means spending too much for one purpose relative to the benefits of alternative uses of those resources. It also encourages spending on low-value uses of those funds. Congress created the congressional budget process to remind itself that resources are scarce in relation to the beneficial uses to which they may be put, and that nothing is free. With scarcity, every decision to use resources in one place requires something else to be sacrificed. As weak and as troubled as the current budget process is, it remains the only salient source of this service of reminding us that using resources for one purpose are costly in terms of others. That reminder is useful in general and for specific policies, including disaster policy, because the limit on spending means that every opportunity cost means every use of resources means you are giving up something else. That limit, when present, forces us to think long and hard about how we use the available resources available in terms of their effectiveness and efficiency. Fully integrating disaster spending into the federal budget through the process I've outlined in my written statement could motivate the clear and thorough reconsideration of current policy that the chairman referred to. And it could do so with respect to improving its performance with regards to equity, efficiency, and sustainability. Hence, my principal recommendation for action is that you consider this change in the budgetary treatment of disasters. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Woodall?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Fopp, you had explained in budgetary terms what I think Mr. Johnson was explaining in man on the ground dealing with disaster terms. Did I understand your testimony correctly, Mr. Johnson, that if we could take the same amount of dollars before a hurricane and after a hurricane, and we're going to get a whole lot more bang for our buck before that hurricane happens?
Yes.
What I don't know is how to allocate those resources. Chairman Hastings showed me the picture from that you referenced. But in Georgia, of course, we're in the cut. We've been very fortunate during hurricane season. If we went through and built everything on 30-foot pilings and reinforced everything with, built it all out of reinforced concrete and cabling, might not be the highest and best use of those resources because we're more 1 in 100 years as opposed to 1 every 5 years. Is it clear to folks who are in harm's way what that allocation of resources looks like? How to Dr. Fopp's point, I can only spend each dollar once. How I make sure I'm spending that dollar on the family that's most likely to be affected as opposed to one that is much less?
Yes, it's our local mitigation strategy prioritizes all of our hazards. We have 12 hazards in South Florida. Earthquakes and volcanoes, luckily, are not one of our hazards, so obviously we don't look at mitigating in those areas. Our number one hazard is flooding. So we have our project priority list. All of the projects at the top of that list are all of our flooding and storm drainage type projects. When I worked in Miami-Dade as well as assistant director there, and we had during the project impact years, and we were actually paying, or through Project Impact, we were providing shutters for low income and elderly populations. And that was just a little bit of money up front for the cost of those shutters, lowered their health, lowered their insurance. It reduced my sheltering population because those folks won't go to a shelter. And it kept them around, that it kept them in the city, just like we saw, the entree of what we saw of Katrina. When those folks leave and they don't come back, they abandon their home, the recovery is so much more devastating, and I question how much better off those folks are that when they left, kind of thing. So that's the long answer to your question, that there are a lot of ways that when we, in looking at the variety of hazards, looking at our priority of our hazards, we can target that money and make it most effective.
And how do I make sure you keep that skin in the game? Again, to Dr. Fopp's point, the opportunity cost on free federal money is very very low. I go up to Maryland and I see beautiful solar panels all across the northern roofs under beautiful oak trees because we subsidized things to such a degree that we didn't need to put it on a south-facing roof and on and on. Recognizing there will be a federal partnership here, how do I make sure you're using the free dollar the very best you possibly can?
We're already following a process, and that is our local mitigation strategy. And our local mitigation steering committee is comprised of individuals and representatives and organizations throughout the community. So they're the ones that help prioritize our community. They're the ones that help understand it. So it's not, my piece of the money or my chunk of the money. They're the ones that then prioritize those projects. And again, if you look at our PPL, you'll see that in concert with our number one risk as our top number of priorities in terms of flooding mitigation.
Well, I was going to ask, because since you had the smaller disaster on your watch, the larger disaster on the next watch, I was actually going to ask what Greenville did differently, knowing you were going to that this could happen again tomorrow if that changed your local budgeting. But please.
Yes, sir. I wanted to sort of just add, piggyback onto an answer here, because we were talking about flooding, but if you recall in Georgia and Atlanta, Snowmageddon in 2014, where the roads were shut down, and because of the extreme ice and weather that came through Atlanta, your entire industries were closed. And these same mitigation dollars would be able to be used in those instances because the infrastructure in those locations rely on mitigation dollars in order to ensure that they are up to par and sustainable to be able to deal with that in the future. So for example, Delta Airlines, that's located there as well, uses and can leverage this type of funding to assist them to prepare in the future and make sure that their runways are still able to move in the way that they need to move. I believe Coca-Cola, Mercedes-Benz are also two organizations that are in that area that are able to use and leverage those dollars in advance. Now, to go to Greenville's situation, I think it's a little different scenario because while there were certainly lessons we learned between 2007 to 2011 to now 2019, the reality we're embracing is that these storms are coming faster, stronger, and they have more water in them. And so we're working very closely. I know the mayor there, and I'm quite positive that the congressman from the 2nd Congressional District, Congressman Thompson, is also very vested in working to make sure that they're able to look at sustainable opportunities and really build such that as these storms continue to come, they can maintain and really play catch up, because that's what's happening.
And from that local perspective, you're right. You've got needs across the board, right? One disaster dwarfs your entire annual budget by a factor of 10. I think about the money we spent in Flint, Michigan, after the fact instead of before the fact. We could have repaired that system for a fraction of the cost of mitigating the damage. But if I go to small town mayors across the country who have failing water systems, those mayors still haven't come up with the extra $1 billion to fix that system. They're going to wait until the catastrophic event happens and their partnership with the federal government changes. What can I do to encourage? Here you are, a moderate to low income community. I still need you doing more. What does that leveraging look like to make it more valuable tomorrow than it is today, to take that preemptive step that is going to take a dollar out of a different pot that you would have otherwise spent it on?
I'll give you a great example, Spartanburg, South Carolina, where they were able to, in a low-income community of color, they were able to utilize roughly a $300,000 EPA grant that was looking at the fact that they were in a community that was susceptible to flooding, susceptible to different types of extreme weather issues. They were able to, in that community, leverage that funding to work with, again, local industries, talk about revitalizing their grid, looking and partnering with FEMA, with HUD, with EPA, with Department of Transportation. And over the course of about 10 years, including revitalizing their wastewater treatment plant, their different methods of just delivering to the community and educating the community at the same time, they turned $300,000 into roughly $300 million. So I think they are a case study in the fact that it can work when you do it ahead of time, when you involve and include local people and you include all aspects of the community. There are success stories in this
I'm
country.
going to tell Jeff Duncan you were bragging about his district up up here. Dr. Fopp, let me ask you, because what divides us so often turns into is a policy debate. As a budgeteer, I want to see us forward fund things because I too believe we make we certainly make worse decisions on the back side. More importantly, somebody's life has been affected that perhaps we could have intervened on their behalf ahead of time and prevented them. The dollars we spent on FEMA trailers after Katrina were not dollars well spent if we could have spent that same dollar to keep a family in their homes ahead of that disaster. But my question is, I come to this from the conservative side of the aisle, but I believe if we did more forward funding of disasters, knowing that the intensity and severity is increasing, that we'd actually change the debate about the nature of climate change, the nature of mitigation in general. Right now, I don't feel the impact because it's an automatic spend in a disaster bill. If I had to pay for it up front, now I'm making the same decisions that Spartanburg and Greenville are having to make, trading different things off. And if the cost of doing nothing is a $50 billion annual upfront disaster appropriation, maybe I'm more interested in partnering with Mr. Hastings on whatever that next environmental bill may be. Through your budgetary lens, do you see an opportunity for forward funding to be a unifying event in Congress? Because ordinarily, trying to parse out the dollars ends up dividing us and leads to more discord.
Yes, I think I do. I mean, I would say that, getting getting the biggest bang for a buck, doing the most good to reduce disaster losses doesn't seem like to me there should be much partisan at stake there. I think it's a bipartisan desire to have a disaster policy that helps people in need and reduces the total overall cost of these losses, meaning that we would keep spending money for disaster mitigation up to the point where spending $1, it saved at least $1 in losses, and for all those dollars that's saved more than $1, it's a great buy, and it's a great buy for people on both sides of the aisle.
Having to put a number on what inaction costs us, Mr. Chairman, is a worthwhile exercise, so it goes beyond the scope of what we're doing here. I've taken too much time. I yield back.
Mr. Morelli?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I must admit, when I saw that you were holding this subcommittee hearing, I was excited about it. I think this is a really important topic, and I'm going to just point to a couple of things, both for me personally and my district. The other thing I was excited about is the Rules Committee is the only committee where you're not limited to 5 minutes in questioning witnesses, but I can see my time is going to be limited anyway, so I'm foiled again. But I do want to thank all the witnesses, and I want to thank the chair and the ranking member for what I think is a very, very important issue. Obviously, folks have touched on the increased occurrence of weather events that come from climate instability. I'm reminded, as I think our grandmothers would say, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and that certainly should be sort of the theme of this hearing. Just from my perspective, my district is upstate New York, Rochester, New York. I sit on the shore, my district, of Lake Ontario. For those who have not been up to the Great Lakes, please come and visit. I know Ms. Scanlon spent some time there. 94,000 square miles of the Great Lakes, the 5 lakes that make up the Great Lakes, 10,000 coastal miles that we share between the Canadian border and the U.S., or the Canadian and U.S. coastline. So it is a massive 21% of all fresh surface water in the world is in the Great Lakes. And what we've seen in my district, we've seen devastation in the last 2 out of the last 3 years, both in 2017, 2019, significantly higher water levels that really started in Superior and work their way all the way down. Lake Ontario is the bottom of the 5 lakes in terms of elevation, so we end up seeing it sometimes years later, a couple of years, believe it or not, it takes the water to flow. But what we know is that it's caused significant disruption, significant property loss and damage over the last several years. When I was in the state legislature before coming here, I got appropriated nearly $100 million for just in along the New York border of the Great Lakes to deal with the devastation. This year, Governor Cuomo's called for $300 million resiliency by the state of New York. And so as I look at this, obviously this is very local and very personal. During my tenure in the state legislature, I was also the chair of the insurance committee and looking at property casualty losses for the state of New York, which included, of course, Long Island and New York City and their proximity to the ocean, Long Island Sound. And I was involved in something called the National Conference on Insurance Legislators to look at resiliency and even suggesting that there might be ways to reduce premiums for those individuals who did the appropriate things, as long as they were actuarially sound, to reduce premiums based on the types of investments you would make in resilient activities around property casualty loss. So this is really, in my mind, very, very important. I'm a proud member of the American Flood Coalition, working alongside our partners here in Congress to identify and invest in solutions that help protect communities. I'm pushing the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to do a coastal resiliency study for the Great Lakes, which was in our appropriation process, and I co-lead that with my fellow New Yorker, Representative John Katko, in a bipartisan effort to do that. So I say all this sort of as background because I think this is truly, truly important, and clearly you see more and more efforts aimed at a conversation about resiliency, and finding the dollars is the question which Mr. Woodall rightly points out. But I thought if I could, just a couple questions, and perhaps I'll start with you, Mr. Johnson. You mentioned Palm Beach County was one of the first jurisdictions in Florida to draft a post-disaster redevelopment plan. And obviously, as we're readjusting, what takeaways can we take from you about building a robust plan that places in my community can learn from as we deal with this flooding? What are those challenges, and how do you get the parties together and get people effectively on the same page?
Well, getting parties together at the table is a lot easier said than done. But again, that's again kind of looking at what we tried to do was kind of look at our number one priority, which is flooding. It's unquestionably flooding in South Florida. Most of our land is between 7 and 8 feet above sea level. So when you term it in terms of flooding, because flooding is definitely an apolitical element. So we coach it all as pretty much flooding. And we think that when we look at all of our stormwater drainage programs and forward pumping strategies and whatnot, we're trying to accomplish the same thing. And so it's kind of a discrete way of dealing with it, again, making it more apolitical. Again, I want to go back to the other solution again I think it needs to tip the process on its head. Because, the National Flood Insurance Program essentially incentivizes people to build in coastal and flood-prone areas, and we've got to stop doing that. We've got to turn it around the other way because we know how well that's working. So, just those kinds of strategies that need to be uniform and community-wide, and I'm not just talking local, I'm talking state and federal.
And what assistance or incentives do you think the federal government doesn't have in place right now that you would encourage to help build these local plans and assist local governments in developing these robust plans?
I think the plans are in place, especially in Florida. As local mitigation strategies required of all of the counties. So I think that the plans are there. I think the reality is the fact that we have to wait until a major disaster occurs in order for us to access HMGP funds. again, is kind of built backwards. If we could do more of a project impact type model and less of the HMGP model in post-disaster cleanup and salvage model, I think that's the way to do it.
Mr. Payotti, am I pronouncing that right, sir? You talked about farming practices to increase resiliency. What barriers are there that the federal government might have in place that we ought to be thinking about removing to help encourage that?
Well, the federal government, primarily through the Farm Bill and the conservation title of the Farm Bill, provides a whole range of information and services and at times funding for farmers to adopt better farming practices. But we need more. It's a shadow of what's incorporated to other parts of the Farm Bill. So more on conservation practices would be helpful. Building off Bill's point, this notion of getting in front of issues is so important. And funding for agricultural conservation easements, potentially targeting easements on property that would be great places to store stormwater or be a natural buffer to flooding would be really great. Now that program right now serves about 8 or 10% of the applicants. And there would be a lot more applicants for it if folks thought the chances of being funded was higher. But that's an example of how farmland protection could, in a proactive way, do exactly what Bill is referring to.
Ms. Tawny, I'm just curious, and I apologize, it's probably my last question. I apologize, Mr. Chair, for going on at some length here. But any lessons that you can teach us about what you experienced that would make the federal process, if it's too cumbersome, less cumbersome, more efficient and more helpful to the local communities as you're going through this process?
Yes, sir. I believe that immediate funding of emergency management personnel is extraordinarily helpful to cities. They're going to expend that funding immediately anyway. And so those are like first top line expenses that can be reimbursed. Typically, a damage assessment is required in those communities, and it does take a while to have officials to come down, do a damage assessment. It is a cumbersome process to get the paperwork done and then approved, and that is if you get a federal declaration, because cities are doing this on the hopes that they get a federal declaration. To have a more streamlined process would not only be effective, it would help cities to save money. That is all, again, on the back end, and I have to agree with my colleagues, the more you put on the front end and maybe giving assessment and climate resiliency technical assistance to communities to help them prepare in advance would greatly reduce this amount on the back end.
So I can't resist, I'll make this my last question, Mr. Chair, but
I thought the other one was.
I may have misspoken. I meant my second to last. Now, this is really my last. But I am curious if you have anything to observe about the link between flooding and toxic algae, which we're starting to see in the Great Lakes, and this is a growing problem. If you have any thoughts about that?
Yes, sir. It's not only a problem in the Great Lakes, it's a problem in the Florida coastlands, it's a problem in Mississippi. I live in Oxford, Mississippi, and we just heard about algae blooms that are coming up in a community not too far from us. So when you do see increased flooding, especially for the length of time that we saw flooding, it began flooding, heavy flooding in Mississippi. I believe we reached flood stage mid-February, and we came out of flood stage in July. The Army Corps of Engineers has been activated since December of 2018. And so with that length of time and that pressure and that amount of water, it is certainly not only going to continue to create situations where you have algae blooms that do reach far across the southeast, but that you see other toxicities as the farmers are working on issues with runoff from their fields because they're flooded. So it creates huge problems that we're working to resolve now.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions other than to, again, remark first of all, what a great panel this is, and secondly, what a distinguished gentleman the chair of this committee is, and how much I value and admire him. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Toward that end, Dr. Burgess has been very gracious in knowing that you all have to go to your 4 o'clock meeting. He is going to forego his question, so we'll go with you, Ms. Cannon.
Thank you very much, Dr. Burgess. Thank you, Chairman Hastings, and thank you all very much for your testimony today. I appreciate the opportunity to address the impact on our communities of natural disasters and how we can build resilience in those communities. Mr. Morelli talked a little bit about the shores of Lake Ontario, where my parents' home has been sandbagged for 2 out of the last 3 years, and that's something that had never happened before because of the rising lake waters there. In the region where I live, we've had increasing extreme weather events, including a lot of flooding, sudden rainstorms, and tornadoes in southeastern Pennsylvania. That has not really been a thing in the past. And I don't think it serves any of us well when Congress is constantly playing catch-up, and aid risks being delayed or denied due to political or regional rivalries or infighting. So I think this is a great panel to talk about these things. Ms. Hamilton, you talked a little bit about building a cleaner, more reliable, resilient, affordable grid, and I was really interested, I don't know if everyone has this, but the committee had these renewable energy jobs, and if we can submit that to the record by unanimous consent. In looking at that, my state, Pennsylvania, lags behind in some of these things, and it's been kind of a frustration as a former school board member when other states would have incentives to push for some of these more renewable, resilient energy pieces. Can you comment on what we need to do across the country to get that kind of a grid and that kind of resilience?
Sure, absolutely, and thank you very much for that question, Ms. Scanlon. And Pennsylvania has a great climate plan that really talks about climate resilience and distributed energy resources as part of that. There are a few things that we need to do that are steps that aren't enormous but can have an enormous impact. One is tax credits, making sure that those still exist for technologies like energy storage and others that can provide backup. And Rochester is a big hub for energy storage technology. It's also one of the coldest places I've ever visited. But another big piece of this is actually leveraging private capital. So the government doesn't have to take this all on its own. There are over a dozen green banks that have popped up throughout the country. And this is something that Pennsylvania and any other state could do, but we need something on the federal side. So in the Senate, this National Climate Bank Act was introduced at $35 billion to leverage $1 trillion. And this is bringing private capital in for communities and projects that were considered too risky to invest in previously. This is bringing in low-cost capital. The government can support some of it and seed it. The examples in the states have shown that for every dollar that the public spends, the private sector comes in with $4. So New York has, a $1 billion green bank. Florida has a much smaller, SELF is a very small program, but they've leveraged hundreds of millions of dollars for projects for communities that are at risk, from climate mitigation events, from frontline communities, lower income communities. And I think that putting some structure in place in the federal sector that leverages all that private sector capital out there would be really helpful and would really scale us and scale all these technologies that we need to deploy.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. My time is rapidly up, but I did want to thank Ms. Tawny for being here. I regularly hear from members of Moms Clean Air Force in my district who have very active chapters, and they're great. So thank you for your testimony today.
Ms. Naylor? Thank you, Ms. Gannon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Burgess. Let me quickly just make a couple of points. Since I live on ground zero, I represent Miami. For us, it's life or death. And since 1950, the sea level in South Florida has risen 8 inches. It's only speeding up now, and by 2030, the sea level in South Florida is projected to rise 12 inches, and by 2100, perhaps 80 inches. So, but we've already done some things in South Florida. As you well know, after Hurricane Andrew, we changed building codes. Very few buildings go down anymore unless a tree falls on them, because the building codes after 2000 have been strengthened across South Florida, and that's made a huge difference. I have a number of points, but I have to get to this caucus, so let me simply say this. I'm very interested in long-term budgeting. I do believe that budgeting ought to be, for emergencies, ought to be integrated into the overall budget. It's kind of a quaint idea now, since no one sort of wants to pay for what we spend, but my longtime friend, the late Alice Rivlin, had argued the case that we ought to integrate the budget. Second, I believe in these public-private partnerships, and I believe if we're created about the infrastructure bill, Mr. Woodall, if we're really creative about the infrastructure bill. And in the speaker's letter, she pointed out that part of the infrastructure bill ought to be, in addition to roads and bridges and public transportation, there ought to be a huge section on the environment and on resilience in particular. That can be a public-private partnership. That could be leverage money to do some of the things we need to do. In Miami Beach, we have raised most of the roads. We've spent millions on pumps, and we've built seawalls. Miami Beach might be able to afford it, though not anymore. I think the residents are getting tired of these extra taxes. But the communities around Miami Beach can't necessarily afford the same thing. So if we're smart in a big-time infrastructure bill, we actually could be very creative and really make a long-term difference. Because in the infrastructure bill, we can do multiple-year funding. And I think that would make a major difference. And I apologize, I've got questions for all of you, but I need to obey my speaker.
All right. Thank you. Dr. Burgess?
Fortunately, I'm not constrained by any deference to the speaker, so we can continue for quite some time, Mr. Hastings.
You notice I'm staying here.
Yes, sir, I do. Well, and I do appreciate all of you bringing what you brought before us. Mr. Johnson, I wonder if you had provided us this nice picture of a homeowner in an empty neighborhood, now an empty neighborhood. And I was just interested, and it really doesn't have anything to do with our discussion here today, but have you mentioned several of the things this homeowner did during the building phase, which allowed him to be standing when everyone else wasn't. So is there, in the arena of best practices, has someone looked at and perhaps ranked those measures that homeowner or home builder took to allow that home to remain standing, so that the next person who's going to build a home next door would be able to look at that menu of options, maybe take that to his or her lender to, what's the most important thing here? The pilings, reinforced concrete in the walls? What is the most important thing, or what are the most important things to preserve a structure? Not that anyone ever wants that to happen again, but you're building on the coast, things happen. So have you looked at sort of ranking those building activities?
Emergency management has not, but I will tell you that there are several universities down in South Florida that have. Again, it's a complex answer to your question. The reality is that the pilings are there because of storm surge. The metal roof there is because of the wind. The elevation is because of storm surge. So it's a multi-factor kind of solution. The fact of the matter is that I believe down in South Florida we have the incentive, if you will, because we've seen things. I think those pictures are very dramatic. And if you've been in my position as long as I have, Mr. Hastings and I both remember Hurricane Andrew down in South Florida and everything in between. When you look at storms, you'll see it's the building code, quite frankly, that does it. And unfortunately, we'll see that the building code in South Florida is dramatically different than it is in North Florida. They're still building homes.
That's what I was going to ask you about that.
And I think that's a local issue, that's a state issue. Right. But again, I would argue that the dollars spent to build these homes with the reinforced concrete and the 15-degree slope roofs and all that other kind of, and those nails and you name it, there's all kinds of things that are brought in the South Florida code, would carry through to, and of course, clearing around your backyard so that when the trees do fall, they don't hit your house and things like that. There's a whole ton of different strategies that can be done, and I think that needs to happen at a local level, but I think it needs to start with some of the, at the federal level that can serve as an example. For example, turning the NFIP on its head and not incentivizing people to build on islands, if you will. And if they do, they need to elevate and those kinds of things.
So I was wondering about that as well, but, heaven help us, I'm not a banker, I should not be, would probably be a violation of so many things if I were put in charge of people's money, but, oh wait, I forgot we're in the Congress. If I were a banker and making a loan, this seems like, okay, this loan is for more than what we would normally lend for a house in this neighborhood. But because of some of the things they are doing, this loan could in fact be better protected than a loan on something that is less expensive.
I agree. I scratch my head. In South Florida, I watched a 30-story condo unit being built. They actually poured dirt. They moved out into the water so that it had, 360-degree view. And it makes me scratch my head as to what loan or lender would want to incentivize that. And it just, it just blows me away that we continue to focus on building on the coastline. And granted, the views are wonderful and whatnot, but I'm not sure that that's really what we need to be doing this day and age.
Well, thank you. And what brought this to mind was having visited down in those areas just north of where Hurricane Andrew came ashore, and it seemed like the houses there were different than houses you see in other places. And I don't know that I'd know this for a fact, but I suspected that was because of local codes that were developed in the aftermath of Hurricane Andrew that, hey, we're not going through this again. We're not facing this rebuilding again. Well, I thank you for bringing the picture and sharing it with us. It certainly very dramatic, and your heart goes out to everybody else in that neighborhood. It clearly was a bad day. So, Dr. Fopp, let me ask you, and you kind of covered this with Mr. Woodall, but I just want to be sure that I'm clear on this. The current process right now in our disaster response, it's post-disaster. And so these are dollars that are not considered under Budget Control Act or the federal budget process.
A relatively small amount as a result of the Budget Act of 2011 that Mr. Woodall referred to, but large portions are treated as emergency spending, yes.
So like when we all had to come back here after Hurricane Katrina and appropriate $100 billion, whatever it was that day, that's all off budget. That's not added to our federal budget.
It's outside the budget process. It's uncontrolled by the other rules of the Budget Act.
So, so what are you thinking of as far as amending our rules to improve? If we were going to move into a pre-disaster funding, and I don't disagree with you, but I've also got some concerns about that, because just as nature abhors a vacuum, Washington abhors dollars that aren't spent. And I would worry about someone figuring that out, and before you know it, the cookie jar is empty when you need it the most.
Well, yes. I have colleagues who give a lot of emphasis to that, and it could be a serious problem. So if you're budgeting money, for example, to a disaster relief fund, and you run some years of good luck, and the fund looks very high, you couldn't stop Congress necessarily from saying, not with any other provision, we're going to do something with that money that we hadn't previously authorized. The nice thing about that is that's pretty transparent. That's pretty easy to see as something that, unless there has been a serious error in estimating the long-term expected losses, that's a violation of good practice. And we've actually had some experience with these funds where, they're called financing accounts, but where you, quote, set money aside. You score it as outlays, it counts, it's included in the deficit, although you don't have to borrow for it, but it's available for spending, and since you've already scored the money when you set it aside, it won't cost anything actually to disperse it. A couple of examples of that are, and people have talked about leveraging guarantees, for example. I assume that's what they mean. We have this kind of forward funding of the cost of guarantees. When we issue a loan guarantee now, we recognize the expected loss on that guarantee and outlay it when the loan is dispersed. And that financing account's accumulated a lot of money. Similarly, for direct loans, we treat them the same way, have since 1990. And earlier than that, this is an odd thing, we actually recognize interest on the debt of the U.S. government as it accrues rather than when it's paid. So if you have a quarter in which the following interest accrues, we outlay it, show it as an outlay, show it as an increase in the deficit, and it goes into one of these financing accounts that have a lot of money in them. They have not been touched. I'm not sure why. You could, I mean, it looks like looks like low-hanging fruit to finance somebody's favorite project. It has not happened. And I think what you want to do to guard against something like that is embarrassment, try to make it so obvious what's happening, that money expected to be spent for another purpose that's important and is accumulated because we've been lucky is not there for spending on other purposes. Otherwise, there's no real way to constrain opportunistic behavior like that.
And it's not just a fact that it's carried on the books so that the deficit looks lower than it actually is?
The deficit looks bigger. It looks bigger than it would on a cash basis because you haven't outlaid the money yet. In other words, we counted in the deficit. So the proposal it developed in the written statement is to follow the model that we use in budgeting for direct loans and guarantees. You recognize what you expect the cost to be up front. You pay it into one of those accounts. It scores as increasing outlays and deficits right then. So people are a little reluctant about appropriating those monies because it's going to be scored right away. And if you're interested in, cost minimization, you now have an incentive that you didn't have before to look at the drivers of those costs of loan defaults, for example. The notion here is that when you make those funds available and score them as outlays before the disaster occurs, then people will have some interest in, what can we do to get more bang for the buck for those monies, because it's counting right now against whatever caps and limits we have.
Well, I thank you.
That was a longer answer than really required.
But it's important because we deal with that on a constant basis. Whether it be healthcare or infrastructure, we have to deal with that constantly. Mr. Hastings, you've been very generous. I'll yield back to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Burgess. I appreciate it. I have 3 unanimous consent requests that I'll make for myself. Ms. Ashley Daniels from North Carolina submitted testimony for us. And as I indicated earlier, we spent a lot of time talking with people in North Carolina. Exelon also submitted testimony to us, and the American Property Casualty Insurance Association, which is pretty important to all of us. So all of those, unless there are objections, admitted by unanimous consent. I'm going to ask staff to send to all of you preparation information that they provided for us on Japan-related background. I think you all will find it of interest. They spend and have spent for a considerable period of time concerns about resiliency. And I come to this having, I think in my second term, visited Japan, and I found it interesting that they are in their diet, their parliamentary structure, was very similar to ours, but they had a related emergency disaster committee that was constituted of all of the chairs of the respective committees of jurisdiction and an appointee by the Prime Minister to that particular group to chair it. And they were able to move their disaster funds a lot quicker than we have here with the tug of war that goes on. And I've seen it from drought not being taken care of for 2 years, blue roofs down in my home territory because we couldn't hook it up. So I'm for the integrated budget, and I appreciate my distinguished friend, Mr. Woodall, for bringing you here, Dr. Falco, and enlightening us. I would that more members of Congress had been here today, particularly on the relevant committees, so that they could hear how we might very well be able to do this. I'll end by asking just a couple of questions of all of you, and I guess it's sort of related, but I'll start with Ms. Hamilton and ask her to talk us through nothing is a silver bullet, but are tax incentives sort of a silver bullet for us in some respect?
We know how to do tax incentives, so it makes them easy. They aren't a silver bullet, but it's something that is easy to administer, and we're used to them. I think there are a lot of other creative things that we can do to move forward. Having a vehicle that would allow for private and public partnerships would be good. Allowing communities to share information, so we can learn from each other and prevent and be able to take some of these lessons learned no matter where you are. So I don't think there is necessarily one silver bullet, but this is something that is not going away, and that preparing in advance is going to be crucial.
Mr. Piotti and Ms. Tawny, can you address this and walk us through how tax incentives help and what their limitations are in rural and agricultural communities?
Sure. Well, the two areas that I identify, both agricultural conservation practices and agricultural conservation easements. On the easement side, right now, we have many states and the federal government allow easements, the donation of easements, to be charitable. That often makes a big difference. Some states have companion programs where there's also a conservation tax credit. There's nothing like that at the federal level, but that could be a very powerful additional incentive. On the farming practice side, there is, as I mentioned before, many good programs in the conservation title of the Farm Bill, but it's really not doing what's needed. The practices that I spoke about, say, the use of no-till and cover crops and rotations, if you look at the national statistics, it varies from area to area, but the percentage of farmers who are using those practices are in the neighborhood of about 6 to 8% at most. It is because farming is such a tough way to make a living, and if you're taking additional steps, it has additional funding costs. So some form of either incentives or additional conservation title funding in the Farm Bill would provide a huge incentive for farmers to do more upfront, and that would have a significant impact on the amount of runoff and the resiliency of farmland and its role in flood mitigation.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Tony?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When we usually think of tax incentives, I agree with my colleagues that it is one solution, but not necessarily the silver bullet, particularly in communities, vulnerable populations and low-income communities, because the idea is going to homeowners and business owners, and oftentimes than not, these are communities where everyone is not included into that group. And so it's created and continues to create problems that we see in areas that are dealing with regentrification. You have communities of color where people may have owned their homes for years, and a natural disaster comes in, they're unable to rebuild or cannot afford the loan, or for whatever reason are not able to stay, and then the area is turned and culturally shifted and changed, which changes the entire dynamics of the neighborhood. We're seeing that not only in New Orleans, but the Florida Keys is experiencing that right now with so many people who simply cannot afford to stay. and it causes a number of huge problems socially for that community. Where are your teachers going to live? Your firefighters, your police officers, where do they afford to live? And so we have to think also for those that are not necessarily homeowners or business owners in terms of our tax incentives, but maybe those who rent and/or living with other family members. I will say that there are some opportunities that we should look at if we're going to talk about tax incentives in terms of making them palatable and reasonable so that everyone can embrace them. When you're talking about businesses and tax incentives, is have we explored opportunities for job creation, tax incentives for people to work in these spaces? Or if you are hiring someone maybe who needs to learn a new trade or tool that is not only sustainable but creates resiliency in the community, connecting with educational opportunities. These are the types of incentives that not only support new business growth and continued existence for that community, but they also sort of spur a pride that folks need to have when they want to stay home and they want to come back home. And that's what I think local folks ultimately want to do. So we should use this opportunity with our tax incentives to just broaden the scope a bit and figure out how we can help all people to not just take a little money off their taxes, but actually stay in the communities that they love.
Let me end our hearing by thanking all of you and drawing from the information that I said that I would send to you about Japan. Among the things that they feel is if they invest heavily in resilience, they will be able to provide more export opportunities from a business standpoint, and therefore they draw in the private sector. And this particular portion of the information says, first, let us present the evidence. The governing Liberal Democratic Party politicians and disaster resilience technocrats in the Cabinet Secretary's National Resilience Council, or the Association for Resilience Japan, and other new institutions are building an economic paradigm based on national resilience. As part of the Resilience Project, the NRC undertook a survey of private sector firms' current and projected spending in late 2015. The survey determined that private sector spending on resilience was about 11 trillion in Japan money, which was 105 billion US. And that total can be broken down into core market segments. And I won't go on, but I want to point out how the three biggest core and related sectors are electric vehicles, renewable energy, solar, and power regeneration and transmission bolstering. And I think all of you have touched in some ways in that regard. I'd like now for us to be able to close and hear from my ranking member, anything he may wish to say at this time.
I was talking to Dr. Funk on the way up about how we so often come and go as members, and there are no bathroom breaks or dining breaks for the panel. I could go about another 2 hours with questions that I have for you, but now that we have all of your contact information, I can find you at home and ask you those very same questions. And so I will do that. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Mr. Getty.
One of the things we do, people think we drink a lot of water because we're hydrating, but we use it as an excuse to go to the bathroom. Before we adjourn, I'd like to reflect on this conversation. It strikes me that for as much as we know about the challenges our communities face due to extreme weather, there's still much we don't know. As is clear, I and Bill Johnson are from South Florida, and I know that hurricanes ruin lives, displace people from their homes, their jobs, and their communities. What I don't think we fully understand is this: what is the human cost of these storms, and how does that cost impact the federal budget? And you all have helped us address some of those concerns today. What happens to educational pursuits, healthcare needs, and related costs? What happens with wages? Our inaction on resiliency planning and preparation, our inaction on investing in building stronger communities today cost taxpayers and all of us money. It also threatens the existence of whole communities, and it definitely threatens lives. For all the time we talk about broadband, are we working to ensure that we are investing in communication technology that will withstand the next disaster in order to keep communities accessible to first responders? And for first responders to stay connected to each other. I, for one, am just tired of them not being able to communicate with each other during the course of disasters. And I think the federal government, state, and local communities should have fixed that problem a long time ago. This will require more conversation and more action. My colleague, Mr. Woodall, and I are prepared to do the hard work to find these solutions. And I just appreciate you all so much taking of your precious time to come up here and be with us. It has been enlightening and informative, and I do believe that as a result of this, and I do thank the staff, there are staff members that are from other committees that are visiting with us, the moms for, what is it? The Clean Air Force, okay. It confused me at first. I was thinking, what do? They fly around out there? But I guess you're everywhere, all right. But there were so many more questions I wanted to ask. I come from farm territory and represent the Glades, Mr. Piatti, along with one other of my colleagues. And when we talk about algae and red tide and all of those things, they are vital concern to us. But this will amuse Bill and you, Mr. Piatti. I recently moved to Boynton Beach. And Bill, I live in Valencia Cove, right? And yeah, and in addition to that, it's in an ag reserve area that was originally ag reserve area, but we have these great developers who I cast no aspersions on that have decided that ag reserve is not as important as some new homes. So everywhere I look, there's more development. And my granddaughter and I, when we go to the movies, we pass by an area and I tell her, I said, I won't be here with you 20 years from now, but you see all of this land right here? This is going to be houses. And you remember when you pass through here that that's going to be the case. And you have made the point that by diminishing the amount of agricultural land, we then cause additional problems in that regard. All of you have been so enlightening and helpful, and I thank you all. And the longer I talk, I don't have to go to this 4 o'clock meeting. Thank you all.